is a columnist for the New York Times, the author of a forthcoming family memoir, The Girl from Human Street, Ghosts of Memory in a Jewish Family. Of particular interest to us this morning is a piece he's just written for The Atlantic magazine. It's called Yes, It Could Happen Again. We'll pop a link up to that on the Sunday Extra website. Roger, welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan.
The world, as I've briefly outlined it there, certainly presents a grim and tense picture just now.
It does. I did not mean to suggest through my piece that I think we're on the brink of World War III. I just intended to remind people that prudence is a wise approach. And the world right now feels to me more fragile, more dangerous than at any time I can remember, partly because I feel the United States and the security of the world has been based principally on a Pax Americana since 1945. I think the U.S. is in an acute phase of retrenchment. And as all these things happen that you just mentioned, there's a kind of vacuum out there.
Well, the tectonic plates of geopolitics are shifting, are they not? And we're looking for a new balance, a new realignment of the tension of power in the world.
They are shifting. It's sort of nobody's world right now. And as you know, historically, there's never been a shift of power from one overarching power to another without some kind of broad, violent episode. So I think it is a moment in which one needs to be vigilant. And of course, we have had the first land grab in Europe by a major power since 1945, the Russian annexation of Crimea. We have President Putin unleashing a wave of violent, irredentist nationalism in Russia that I think will be very hard to contain, and the genie's out the bottle in the eastern part of Ukraine. It'll be very hard to put it back. And of course, all this is happening in an area where the United States has treaty commitments under the NATO alliance to the Baltic states, like Estonia, where there are also large numbers of Russian speakers, and President Putin has vowed to defend Russian speakers wherever they are.
All of which makes this past week's anniversary of the First World War look particularly resonant. I mean, it's a great habit of the way in which humans perceive their world, that to look at the contemporary situation, you tend not to see the connections and the underlying mechanics. As we look back at 1914, we see that with a certain clarity. We can sense the inevitability. It's much harder to see those patterns in your own time.
Absolutely, and I don't think anyone in 1914 thought that when a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, shot the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, that would trigger a conflagration in which 16 million people would be killed and 4 empires undone. And I think it's in the nature of these catalysts or triggers that they are often unexpected. When I was dreaming up scenarios for that piece in the Atlantic, it never occurred to me that a bunch of separatists in eastern Ukraine, maybe with a vodka too many, having been given sophisticated equipment by the Russians, would shoot down a civilian aircraft, Malaysian Airlines plane. Now that could easily have been a trigger. It wasn't in the circumstances, because I think both Europe and the United States are looking away very determinedly from any kind of potential conflict right now, and are weak, frankly, in their reactions to President Putin. But that's the kind of thing, or imagine in the East China Sea that a ship runs aground in what Japan calls the Senkaku Islands, and the Chinese send a warship, then something happens between the Japanese and Chinese, and again, you have Article 5 of the U.S. alliance with Japan, which obliges, just as in the Baltic states, the U.S. to get involved. Now, whether those treaty obligations still hold, President Obama was a little evasive about that when he was in Asia recently. That, in my view, can be even more dangerous when these treaties are no longer sacrosanct. Then everything is up for grabs.
You've touched on it there, but you do a bit of wargaming in this piece. Give us a sequence of events which could, from where we are now, lead us to calamity.
Well, you could easily imagine that President Putin, in his current mood and with the current mood in Russia, decides that it's not enough to have stirred up the Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine and to have annexed Crimea and to have an ongoing mini-war in the eastern part of Ukraine where several hundred have already died, but decides that he wants to ignite a little bit of unrest in Latvia or Estonia or both. You could have a violent incident or two with Russian speakers in Estonia, for example, saying that they want to rejoin the motherland or some such. Then let's say you have a Republican Congress in the U.S. after the midterms, and right-wing Republicans start saying, well, what? The President of the United States is going to sit and watch as Estonians are killed when they're a NATO ally of the United States, and combined with some other incident. I mean, you're in Australia. You've no doubt been following this more closely than I have, but it's very clear that China, in both the South and East China Seas, is in a mood of assertiveness that is creating tensions not only with Japan, but with the Philippines, Vietnam. Now, Philippines and Vietnam are not in alliances with the United States, but still, these are the kinds of things that, with the United States being an important Asian power and regarded as important by Australia, by countries that are restive about or somewhat anxious, while seeing advantages, also seeing dangers in China's rise. I think the most dangerous part of the world probably is Asia right now. Not right now, but over the next several years. I don't think China's going to assert a Monroe Doctrine, the doctrine under which basically the United States declared that it would not let foreign powers into the Americas. You could see this assertiveness of China bringing extreme tensions with Japan, and that is very dangerous.
Tensions with Japan, tensions with Vietnam too, that we're already seeing. I wonder, as we look back at 1914, I mean, a characteristic of that time was structures within countries that made it very easy for those countries to be moved as a bloc into the situations of confrontation. The politics is a bit different now. I mean, it's a little harder to drag an entire people to war, and much more difficult than it was at the turn of the 20th century.
I absolutely agree with you, Jonathan. Look, I don't want to overplay this. There's a lot that the world has learned. There's a lot that the world never learned. But it's clear that our hyperconnectedness these days, the fact that there are no longer, it's very hard to keep secrets. Voices are raised. This often creates a cacophony in which it's hard to make policy, and it's certainly hard to be statesmanlike. But equally, as you said, I think it's hard to drag whole peoples, whole nations into war, especially as we know what kind of war that would be if the major powers are involved. So there are all kinds of breaks that didn't exist 100 years ago.
I mean, that's a very good point you make in the piece too, is that on the nature of the war. Yes, armaments are extraordinary these days, but the nuclear deterrence with what is it, 18,000 or so warheads in the world, that's a sobering feature as well.
It is, and let's hope there's not more proliferation, and that the United States and Iran and the major powers working with the United States can reach an agreement on the Iranian nuclear program, because certainly a nuclear-armed Iran would be extremely destabilizing and dangerous, and another potential trigger of a wider war than all these small wars that we are seeing at the moment. I mean, the whole rise of ISIS in this swathe across Syria and Iraq, the unending war in Syria, and the Israeli-Palestinian. When you think that only 3 years ago, a little more, we had the Arab Spring and all the hope that went with that, it's very, very sobering and frankly saddening.
As we look back on 1914, what's the lesson do you think that we should carry forward into our present time?
I think the lesson is that a degree of pessimism, of caution, is extremely important in analyzing international affairs, and that great powers always vie with each other, especially when there is a moment of flux like the current one. They're always looking for advantage. And nobody thought when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia as a result of the assassination that Russia would immediately come in on the Serbian side, and then Austria-Hungary thought it had to declare war on France, Russia's ally, and that in turn brought Britain in against Germany. Things, when they do spiral downward very fast. And I think we've learned in the last 20 years that the optimism that went with the end of the Cold War, where President Clinton, very intelligent man, obviously, was saying that henceforth Western liberalism had essentially won and that global affairs were no longer a zero-sum game and that countries would act, could be counted upon to act in their enlightened self-interest. But this was an illusion, that the old competition between great powers go on. And so we should be very prudent, very vigilant, and very attentive to all these conflicts to try to prevent them from exploding into something that would drag everyone in.
A degree of pessimism may well be warranted. Roger, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Roger Cohen. He's a columnist for the New York Times. We'll pop a link. The article we've been chatting about, yes, it could happen again. It's titled from the Atlantic magazine. You'll find that link on the Sunday Extra page of the RN website.
There you go. 1914, 2014. Are they about to do it again? Everybody's looking at the Ukraine and Donetskistan and Gaza, and they're not paying any real attention to quarantining Ebola. Bit sad, isn't it? Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.